going to be talking about what happened in France after Napoleon's exiled. I'll kind of get into that because France goes through a lot of changes afterwards. They actually, go kind of between a republic and an empire. They make a lot of reforms to the country. So I'll kind of talk about that mostly, and then I'll also spend some time talking about what happens in Russia because Russia goes through a lot of changes in the 1800s as well. Later in the week, I'll also talk about the Industrial Revolution as well. That begins in Europe, Britain. I'll get into like the rise of socialism, and I'll also talk about like the rise of things like imperialism, nationalism, which were also other big things that happened in 19th century Europe and other parts of the world. So one of the first things, of course, I'm going to talk about today is we're going to get into and discuss, of course, the restoration of the Bourbons. The Bourbons are put back in France after Napoleon's exile. And if you know about this, it's all because of the Congress of Vienna that, of course, we had talked about before that had met, remember, in Austria between all the major powers. And they had, sent Napoleon to exile twice, one in 1814 to Elba, and then 1850 to St. Helena in the Atlantic. And so from there, the Bourbons were restored to the French throne. Here's kind of an image, of course, of the Congress of Vienna right there, which, like we talked about, kind of reestablished Europe being more conservative. It's one of the things that happened. You can see there Clemens von Metternich, that famous minister of Austria, was one of the main architects of that. And so afterwards, conservative Europe from, I guess, around 1814 up to 1848. It's often later called the Age of Metternich because of his influences and all that. Now, I'll get into today and talk about the restoration of the Bourbons. I'll kind of blow him up right there. But you can see there one thing that happened after the Bourbons were restored. They put in, of course, a famous king there, Louis XVIII. Who reigned? He reigned in 1814, and then Napoleon kind of dislodged him because of coming back with his 100 days, 1815, and so he came back again, as you know. And anyway, about him, he was the younger brother of Louis XVI. If you remember correctly, had died on the guillotine during the French Revolution. Remember, there was no Louis XVII that really reigned. That was the son of Louis XVI, but he had died in prison during the French Revolution. And so they kind of count him. Louis XVII is kind of reigning, but even though he wasn't. If you know about the Bourbons, too, they kind of refuse to say that the French Revolution happened or Napoleon happened and things like that. And so they act like it didn't happen and all that. So he came in. He wasn't exactly a popular ruler. He had a nickname. He was called the Desired, believe it or not. But under him, it wasn't like absolutism in the ancient regime. They put in a constitutional monarchy, which a lot of that was forced on them by the British, because the British wanted them to create more of a parliamentarian constitutional monarchy that was more like what they had and all that. And so they eventually adopted a new constitution, which was often called different names, but I think the common name is the Charter of 1814 is what they usually called it. And kind of show some stuff here. Of course, we'll get to the Revolution of 1830. It's also called the Constitutional Charter of 1814. They'll use that name as well. But under this new constitution, they had a bicameral legislature, which the French had been having going back to like the 1790s. Because I think under Napoleon, they had like a bicameral type assembly at the Parliament, which had this Senate in it called the Conservative Senate. Have you ever heard of it? But this one had two chambers, which was often called the chambers as a nickname, the chambers of deputies and then the chambers of peers. The chambers of deputies was for like the middle class. It was more like the House of Commons. And then the other one, which was the chamber of peers, was more like a House of Lords or like the nobility, because they put the peerage back in, or nobility was brought back in to France when the Bourbons were put back in. Included like a Bill of Rights guaranteeing like equal rights were put in it as well. And by the way, I've got an image of this here, but the actual chambers met at the Luxembourg Palace in Paris, which is, by the way, the current site of today's the French Senate. If you know about the French Parliament, which is the upper house of basically the French Parliament and all that. And that site has actually been used as a lot of assemblies, especially going back to the time of Napoleon, because that's where originally the conservative Senate met under Napoleon, although it was kind of almost like a rubber stamp, the Senate under Napoleon. But that's, of course, a famous, public building, in France, of course, today. But under the charter, they had various rights that were guaranteed: freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, property rights, etc. And then, of course, one thing that started to happen in France at that time, if you knew about it, was they started to bring in male suffrage, where men could vote and things like that. But a lot of it was based off of poll taxes. I think if you wanted to vote, or you wanted to hold like a position in the government, like in the assembly, parliament, you had to pay a tax, though, with that. The king was pretty powerful, although it was a constitutional monarchy. The king did have certain rights, more really great powers than I think later monarchs have under him. I know under Louis XVIII and Charles X, they could even like have ordinances or edicts they could issue and things like that to create laws, believe it or not, or even design laws that were given to the parliament as well. But I think they're commander-in-chief and things like that. And they could also, put judges and other people in power as well, like most executives do, et cetera. The only thing about, if you study about Louis XVIII, he had no children, and so the throne had to pass to his younger brother, Charles X, who was also known as the Count d'Artois. And I'll get to him next. He was the last Bourbon king that you have of France that comes in. Here's an image of Charles X right there. Remember, there were three brothers, right? You had, which were Louis XVI, Charles X, and of course, I just talked about Louis XVIII. And he had been in exile for years. The only thing about him, he was kind of a radical monarchist, because of the fact that he was like this ultra royalist that felt like he wanted to put the ancient regime back in the way it was before. Because under this government, it was more like a constitutional monarchy. And so he opposed a lot of concessions toward liberals. He was more supportive of conservatives, of conservative ideas and things like that, which I guess were granted in the Charter of 1814 at the time. And so later it's going to end up coming back to bite him, if you know about this, because 1830, you'll later be overthrown. Because I think Louis XVIII is the last monarch of France that dies on the throne, because I think the other ones afterwards are deposed. You know, of course, about that. Charles X is, by the way, the one that initiated the French conquest of Algeria, which is kind of a controversial topic, if you know about that. He initiated starting around 1830-31. It's about when it kind of gets going. They say it was actually created to distract citizens of France because they were having economic problems in the country. But it's something that the French eventually start to expand their empire into Africa. You start to see this in the 19th century with a lot of European powers with new imperialism that gets started. Of course, they're also in like South America later, the French, and even Southeast Asia, like Vietnam and Indochina and all that later. It is a controversial event because of all the genocide that supposedly was committed against the Algerian population. Of course, the Algerians, responded with some kind of form of guerrilla warfare, which lasted for decades. And so it took the French years to actually conquer Algeria in North Africa. And later it's added to, of course, the French Empire and the Republic and all that. Let me get out other images, but they think that's where the French Foreign Legion got started. If you know about that particular famous military unit of the French, where even foreigners joined it a lot, and so they got started as part of the kind of they call it the Army of Africa, I think is what the French called it originally. And so their soldiers become elite soldiers that are famous for fighting all over the world and all that. And they're famous for their white helmet, their hats that they wear. You see right there. They made movies, of course, about the French Foreign Legion. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie March or Die with Gene Hackman, and it's pretty good. Late 70s. I think that's one of the most famous ones I've ever seen that's about the French Foreign Legion, but there's other ones that have been done too, more in modern times as well. Now, of course, what eventually happened to, of course, Charles X, he was eventually overthrown in a revolution, which is called different names. The common name they call it is the July Revolution of 1830, but some people call it also the French Revolution of 1830. I think the French also call it the Three Glorious Days as well, because that was the amount of time that it took in July of 1830. And a lot of it was caused by the fact that Charles X wanted to kind of reenact more power behind his throne and, I guess, bring back the ancient regime, make it more like an absolutist type government than maybe being constitutional, like a constitutional monarchy and all that. And it was caused by the July ordinances that he issued at the end of July of 1830, which it was an attempt to give him more power, but also to eliminate the press, I think was another thing he was trying to do. He actually dissolved at one point the Chamber of Deputies, which was the main chamber for, like, I guess, the middle class and others. He was going to try also to exclude them from voting as well. And so the people got wind of this, and it basically caused a coup d'etat, where he basically got overthrown. And so he basically ends up getting overthrown. It appeared like a few days at that point. So July 26th to about the 29th is usually considered the days of the actual July Revolution, where he gets, overthrown. And that basically ends the Bourbon dynasty, because he's the last Bourbon monarch that, like I said, is in power at that point. Of course, later it led to various, paintings that were done, of course, you saw that one I just showed you right there. But of course, the most famous painting, of course, is Eugene Delacroix. Of course, the Liberty Leading the People, of course, I kind of showed you a little short video on that. But yeah, that was a painting that depicted the revolution. And you can also see how it involves, not just men and women, but I guess even kids kind of get involved in it. Maybe even form of propaganda maybe being used. But that's an image that you start seeing. And of course, the tricolor flag, of course, used by the French, it's become standard afterwards as the national flag of France, following, of course, this revolution. I think Sean was talking about the Abbott and Costello. Yeah, it's funny about that Foreign Legion. It's been all kinds. I think there's been some, what was that, Claude Van Damme or whatever, Jean-Claude Van Damme, I think has been in some movies like that with the French Foreign Legion. I'm talking about the martial arts guy. He's got one too. I forget what it's called, but something like that. But anyway, so you have that. Oh yeah, here's of course an image of Eugene Delacroix on the right there. That's actually a self-portrait of himself, of course, right there. So I think that's his only greatest painting. I think he had some other paintings he did, but that's the one that's the most famous. That's now in the Louvre, of course, today. All right, so now what happened was after they deposed him, they then put in Louis Philippe, who was like a cousin, basically of Charles X, that it was previously the ruler. He reigns for about 18 years, from 1830 to 1848. They gave him different nicknames afterwards, July Monarchy or something like that. They called him, or the King of the French People, I think was the common name, or some even called him Citizen King as well. And It's because he was elected, you know about this, to the monarchy of France. So it was done in like I guess, a referendum by the people and all that. And he came from what they call the Orleans branch, which the Orleans were like a cadet branch of the Capetian dynasty of France. So they're cousins of the Bourbons. And Louis Philippe had been in exile for years because, I guess, of the French Revolution and Napoleon and all that. I think they're kind of related back to, I don't know if you heard of Louis Philippe. He was the Duke of Orleans, and he's the one that New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, is named after. Maybe about that. He's got, goes back to the, I think, early 1700s and all that, but he's kind of a distant relative to him. But he's the only actual monarch they had of that dynasty of the Orleans branch, or Orleans, I guess how they say it, of course, in French. So anyway, talking about him, Louis Philippe, right there. Now, yeah, he's also famous for, I'll kind of mention about this, which I sometimes like to talk about, but Louis Philippe was the one that brought the remains of Napoleon back to France in 1840. Because remember correctly, Napoleon had been buried on St. Helena in the Atlantic when he died in 1821. And so there was this movement to bring him back and bring like the glories of France back to France and all that. And if you know about Louis Philippe, he was also the one that turned the Chateau de Versailles into a museum because it wasn't being used at the time. And so that he also did that. And so they would put him in this tomb in Invalides, which, by the way, is if you wonder what that is, it's a collection of museums and monuments towards like France's like heroes in their history. And it's also got a hospital, believe it or not, and a retirement home for like war veterans. But it's got a lot of people buried there, not just Napoleon, but I think it's got like something like 46 people, I think, that are buried there that are famous. Like I know Ferdinand Foch, I think, is the most famous general buried there besides Napoleon from World War One. And then I know some of Napoleon's relatives are buried there too, like Jerome Napoleon, Joseph Napoleon, etc. also as well. So it's got a lot of famous heroes that are buried there. So it's also a tourist attraction that people like to go tour in Paris, besides the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre and all that. But I think he was doing it also to try to, make him more popular, but it kind of backfired on him. And it made Napoleon and the Bonapartists more popular, I think is what ended up happening. He would end up getting overthrown too. By the 1840s, there was a lot of economic conditions that were bad in France and parts of Europe. Also, the Industrial Revolution was starting to take off in the 19th century. And so you had a lot of people that wanted like more rights, not just as workers, but political rights and things like that. And so they had this so-called February Revolution in 1848, which was part of a wider series of revolutions that broke out in Europe called the Revolutions of 1848. And a lot of it was like a rejection of like Metternich's conservative policies that he pushed going back to the Congress of Vienna. And so all these working class people start to have more rights, and you start seeing like movements like the socialist movement, communist movement kind of start taking off too as well by the mid to late 1800s. All those movements, I guess people dread later, etc. But yeah, they had revolutions that broke out in all kinds of countries: Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, etc. A lot of them were forced later to create like constitutional monarchies. You start seeing that where they give people more rights and things like that. But a lot of them were crushed somewhat. I know in Hungary, they crushed it for a while, for like at least up to the 1860s. But within 20, 30 years, like it's saying, they're going to have to be forced to give people more rights and things like that, right to vote, et cetera, like in Germany, et cetera. But France, it actually, here's kind of more images of even Karl Marx wrote a history of, by the way, of the revolution that happened in Germany with that occurred 1848, 49, I think it was. But one of the things that happened in France was they eventually decided to establish, because of the February Revolution with Louis Philippe being overthrown, they decided to bring the Republic back in. at that point. So the French Republic is formed again at that point. The Second Republic of France that they have. France had like 5 of them. I think the current one now is the Fifth Republic of France that they've got. And under this republic, if you study about it, they eventually elect one of the first presidents that they have of France. They have a unicameral assembly at first. Later, they have, bicameral like they have now. But they went to actually having just a unicameral under the initial Second Republic, which was called the National Assembly, is what they called it, which came from the old name from the assembly going back to the French Revolution. And then they had a president of France, of course, that they elected at that point in 1848, which originally had a 4-year term to it, which I think now it's 5 years. That's what the term is in France, modern republic today. And elected via, you see, direct universal suffrage, male suffrage, of course, at the time, although only for 1 term, which was one of the controversies about that, of course, later. So they would end up electing Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who you see on the left. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was related through a brother of Napoleon named Louis Bonaparte, who, by the way, had married one of the daughters of Josephine, believe it or not, Hortense, I think her name was. And so, believe it or not, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was related to Napoleon and Josephine. It's kind of weird about that, but he is. So he would come to power in 1848. He had been in exile for years, and then after, I guess, Louis Philippe basically brought back Napoleon's remains and all, he was able to kind of come back to France. And the Bonapartists were starting to become popular, if you know about that. Became kind of even a political party in France at the time. And but the only thing was with him, if you study about him, he's going to eventually, within a few years, realizing that he can only have 1 term as president of France, he decided to basically overthrow the government. And so in this kind of like self coup d'etat, basically, which happened December 2nd was the anniversary date of when Napoleon first, was crowned. He basically overthrew the government, dissolved the National Assembly, and basically becomes almost like a dictator at that point. But he's going to go on to establish basically the Second French Empire, which the Second French Empire will last officially from 1852 to 1870. So about 18 years is how long it's around. And of course, he would become Emperor of France as Emperor Napoleon III. And of course, notice the that being used, Napoleon III. So he was recognizing that there was a Napoleon II, which was the son of Napoleon, even though he never really reigned as an actual ruler. But yeah, Napoleon III, he was kind of part of the Bonapartists. So I'll kind of show another image of him. Right, I'll come back to that image in a second. But he was part of the Bonapartists, which were kind of a political party in France that wanted to restore the house of Bonaparte, which was seen as a royal dynasty related back to Napoleon, which was conservative, but also a monarchical type empire, of which it would be. And he's the only ruler of it, if you know much about, of course, Emperor Napoleon III. Kind of show an image here, but here's kind of an image of territories that the French controlled at one point. You can kind of ignore those areas that are in the Americas because they eventually lose that over time. But the French Empire was pretty large in size. Most of their empire would be primarily Africa and also parts of Asia. So that's mostly where they were at one point. Under him, they would put more emphasis on mostly Africa, like Algeria, West Africa, also Madagascar, which the French were there for a long time as well. Southeast Asia, the French go into Indochina, which later is known as, Vietnam, they call it, of course. French Guiana, another thing, of course, was also created as another colony as well. Yeah, there's other areas too. Like at one point, they had like parts of America, which they lost that after the 7 Years' War. Haiti was lost because of the Haitian Revolution. But for a long time, they owned some islands that were in the Caribbean as well. So I think there's some islands they own like around the world, but most of the areas that they own are not really controlled anymore by the French. No, French Guiana still controlled by them. Of course, Corsica today is also part of that as well. I think Martinique might be still part of the French, I believe, as well. Now, I'll talk more about Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor Napoleon III. He's also known for doing a lot of things with modernization. I'll kind of get into this today as well. But he had this French official that was under him that was kind of very famous named Haussmann, Baron George Eugene Haussmann. He was very important in modernizing the city of Paris. Like you know about the City of Lights in Paris, they did a lot of urban renewal with it in the 1800s to try to modernize it. It was actually a model of modernization for other, cities throughout the world. It was controversial too at the time because they destroyed a lot of buildings and things like that that went back to, I guess, going back to before the French Revolution, all that. But new boulevards were put in, new parks, new public works were all put in, of course, under Haussmann. And here's some other pictures of it, of course. And so the innovation of it, you can see there, original of it was, put around where the Arc de Triomphe is, of course, in Paris. And so this actually helped to modernize other cities around the world. Paris became this model city for other cities. I've got a list of them right here, but all these cities like Cairo in Egypt, Buenos Aires, South America, Brussels, Rome in Italy, Vienna, Austria, Stockholm, Madrid, Spain, Barcelona, Spain, Berlin, even copied, believe it or not, Paris. So now I think Paris is interesting too because of the fact that it wasn't really bombed in World War II like some of these other European cities, powers, cities were during the war. And so that is part of why it's so unique as well. So it's not you get to look at the old, I guess France that used to be there, at least going back to the 1800s. But like a lot of your cities in like say, London, Berlin or whatever were destroyed during World War II and were rebuilt. Yeah, they're all kind of like similar, I guess, some similar kind of architecture, in the 1800s, I guess, that was modeled like that. Also, people forget that it was under really, you think about um, Emperor Napoleon III, they also began to invest a lot of money into the Suez Canal, which was completed, by the way, in 1869, which with a kind of an influence between the French and the British. It helped to kind of get it built. And it was an idea that they talked about for years to kind of create a shortcut between, the Mediterranean Sea to like the Indian Ocean, because before that you had to go around Africa. If you know about that, if you wanted to go from Europe to say India or the East. And it was built by this man named Ferdinand de Lesseps there, who was mostly an entrepreneur. That was the main guy behind it. And I think he tried to build later, if you know about this, like a type of Panama Canal, but it failed in the late 19th century. And I think I've got images showing of it right here. But yeah, opened in 1869. It took thousands of workers, which most of the workers were Egyptian, that actually built the Suez Canal. Estimated 120,000 workers may have died in the construction of it. It's about 120 miles long, and it goes from between the Mediterranean into the Red Sea, as you know. And so, yeah, it's considered one of the most famous, canals in the world up there with the Panama Canal. And it helped to shorten the distance, between, um, you know, um, I guess Europe and the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean by several thousand miles, thousands of miles. So that's the Suez Canal. Of course, Suez Canal is now in the hands of course, uh, Republic of Egypt. Of course, a controversial issue we'll talk about later, which happened, of course, during the Cold War era, but that of course eventually does occur later. Of course, you may have heard about the story about Devil's Island. That's something that Napoleon III was also well known for establishing. Which, if you know about Devil's Island, it was a famous penal colony that was part of now what is called French Guiana in South America, kind of the northeastern part of South America, where the capital is Cayenne, excuse me. And apparently, under Napoleon III, who was, like I said, a staunch conservative, he wanted to get rid of people that were considered like dregs of society. And so thousands of people were sent there, just got rid of you. If you're a criminal, they got rid of you and they sent you there to Devil's Island. And they had prisons on the island itself. And then if you know about the worst ones, were sent to these islands that were off the coast. And so hence the term Devil's Island prison colony or whatever was, of course, used because of that. And it was around for about a century. 1852 was when it was opened, and it closed in 1953. So a long, long time ago. And it's known for a lot of horrors, because a lot of people went there, they died. They didn't come back, if you know about it. I think I've got other images showing images of Devil Island, of course. There's the ruins of it, because I think it's now a tourist attraction now, if you go there to look at it today. There are some of the islands, of course, that are part of it. I think it had 3 islands which were there. The one in the middle you're seeing there is called Royal Island. The one to the top right is St. Joseph Island. And the one on the top left, that smaller one, that was what they call Devil's Island, hence the name where it came from. It had a death rate of something like 75%. So 75% of the people that went to the system died. Something like that amount. And even if you serve your full term, you couldn't go back to France. You had to live actually in French Guiana. So they also were kind of doing that to try to populate it as well, which, the British did that too with colonies like Australia, Georgia, New Zealand, and things like that to try to colonize certain areas of the world. So they were kind of trying to do the same thing also as well. Yeah, they made movies out of it. I think there's been 2 made, but I know the one Papillon with Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman, that's the one that's the most famous one that was made. I think they just a few years ago remade it. I don't know why they did that. This one was pretty good. 1973, I know. But anyway, they've made movies a lot about it, but now it's like a tourist attraction today. But yeah, it's notorious, for all the people that went there, of course, and died. It makes Angola look like a hotel. Now let's see. Also, another thing that happened too, I did want to mention about Napoleon III also tried to take over Mexico, which he did in the 1860s. This was part of this thing called the Second French Intervention in Mexico. It's kind of well known. And he put this cousin on the throne who was actually a Habsburg named Maximilian. They called him Emperor Maximilian I. And part of why the French invaded Mexico in the 1860s was because of the fact that Mexico evidently owed a lot of debts to like banks, foreign banks, and things like that. They weren't paying their money. And so they went in there to try to get their money. And then while they're at it, they decided to take it over and try to make it part of, I guess, of the French Empire and all that. And this was kind of controversial at the time because it was going on at the same time when the American Civil War was going on to the north. The French were kind of supportive of the Americans somewhat, in the Confederates in the South anyway, during the war. But yeah, it became like this French client state is what it was. And you can see all the areas that I didn't really occupy the whole country, but you can see in that blue area, they occupied those areas. That in Mexico City, they eventually took that over as well. But eventually, under Benito Juarez, who was the president later of Mexico, they later captured Maximilian and had him shot. So that was kind of a failure. I do know the United States, they have this holiday that you've heard of called Cinco de Mayo, which is celebrated every May 5th, which is associated with that actual conflict because of the Battle of Puebla, which was one of the famous battles like associated with it. Well, we'll talk about more about Napoleon III. He does get into a lot of other conflicts. He gets into the Crimean War is another thing he'll get into, where he'll support Britain, and the Ottoman Empire against Russia. So he's involved with that. I think I'll get to it later too. He also helps to unify Italy, believe it or not. Napoleon III, he kind of backed the Kingdom of Sardinia into forming like the Kingdom of Italy and all that. And so he was involved in that also as well. But he'll eventually get overthrown. We'll talk about Napoleon III. He'll later, he actually, his empire collapses later during the Franco-Prussian War when Prussia invades France in 1870, and he's forced to basically abdicate. He abdicates the throne and all that and goes into exile. And that'll lead to the so-called French Third Republic. And so France after that is a republic, from 1870 to the present, which they've gone through, I think, three other republics, Third Republic, Fourth Republic, and then now they have a Fifth Republic. That's right now. But pretty much after that, there's no more monarchs. Now I'm going to move on next. I'm going to talk about, of course, we'll get into the Russian Empire. I'll talk kind of a few minutes today about, what's going on with the Russian Empire in the 19th century, which was there. You can see the Russian Empire is vast. I'll kind of expand that right there, but you can see it goes from parts of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, part of Poland, etc., on all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So where Vladivostok is, etc. And following the Russian Empire, if you study about the Russian Empire, it became more conservative, like a very conservative state in the 1800s. And a lot of it was because of Napoleon. Napoleon invaded, remember, Russia in 1812. And so I think there have been some talk of maybe, adopting some of these liberal ideas that Napoleon and the French Revolution were spreading in Europe. Even some of, I think, the officers that were in the Russian military were supportive of that idea. But because of what happened with Napoleon invading in 1812, basically the emperor at the time, Alexander I, pretty much went against that. So he became a staunch conservative. A lot of the czars afterwards, of course, become very conservative. I think the only one that was kind of somewhat a reformer was Alexander II, we'll get to later, who freed the serfs, of course, in Russia. But he reigned from 1801 to 1825. By the way, the Russian state in the night was still kind of semi-feudal, so it was still kind of backwards at the time. Most of the power was in the hands of the nobility, so they're ones that had all the power. Still isolated, they still weren't modernized like the other powers in Europe. Like they weren't really industrializing, like say Britain is in the 1800s, Germany, etc. And so they were kind of behind that. With that, they were oppressive. Censorship was quite common. I just told you that the czars were pretty much anti-liberal as well. Russia also became weak internationally. I'll get to it later. They lose a lot of wars in the 19th century. They lost the Crimean War to France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire. They even lose against Japan, which is kind of pathetic. I think Russo-Japanese War. Well, that's the early 1900s, really. But that's another thing that really causes it as well. These are all the czars, by the way, that were basically that ruled in the 19th century. You can see right there. So Alexander I, we're just talking about him, 1801, 1825. But you had other czars, Nicholas I, you can see Alexander II, Alexander III, and then you got the last czar, of course, of Russia, which, of course, Nicholas II. So it even shows some of the things that they're kind of famous for under each one of them. By the way, at the time when I guess all this is going on in the 19th century, Russia is about the size of about 8.8 million square miles. So Russia, I think, is the third largest empire in history. I think behind the British Empire and the Mongol Empire in that order. But a population of 110 million people. This is by the 1890s that they have. But most people in, if you know about Russia, live in the western half. Like that's west of the Urals. Like Siberia, I think they only have like 20% of the population actually lives there, like eastern part of Russia. Russia, by the way, is notorious for exiling people to Siberia, not just to colonize it, but to get rid of people that are kind of like enemies of the state. I know under the Russian secret police, under the czars, which is called the Okhrana, they started doing that. And then under, like, if you know about under like the Bolsheviks, like under, I guess, the Cheka, or I guess they call it NKVD, KGB, they also sent a lot of people into exile or sent them to gulags also as well. So that's one thing they're kind of course, well known for. And they started doing this back in the 18th century, doing this. Not something that's later that they do. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the early czars, like Alexander I in the 19th century. Like I said, he was a grandson of Catherine the Great. Originally, he was reform-minded. I think that was kind of caused by really the 18th century, with the French Revolution and I guess the early ideals of Napoleon as well. He was conservative, though, because of Napoleon, invading, like I said, Russia at that time. He was also involved in a lot of alliances and trying to keep a balance of power in Europe. He was, Alexander I was basically helped Metternich, keep Europe conservative, prevent the spread of liberalism and things like that. And so he was a supporter of that overall. However, the only thing about him was he didn't have any children. And so the throne would then have to go to one of his younger brothers, which he had two younger brothers that could have gotten the throne. They were all grandsons also of Catherine the Great. And Pavlovich, of course, the first one. And then also Nicholas, who was later known as Nicholas I, as well, Emperor Nicholas I. The ruler that was supposed to get it, of course, it's going to spark this thing that's called the Decembrist Revolt, which I'll get to in a second right here. But he was actually supposed to be the next heir to the throne, Constantine, his middle brother, right there. The only thing about him was he was at the time under Alexander I. He was the governor of Poland. And I think, had married a Polish wife, and he didn't really want to be the next emperor of Russia. And so he declined the throne and abdicated it and gave it to his brother, Nicholas I. And so the only thing about that issue was that it caused a succession crisis, where you had some people that were in the military didn't like this whole situation of the throne going to Nicholas instead of Constantine. And so it caused this thing in December 1825 that was called the Decembrist Revolt, which happened mostly in St. Petersburg. And so you had this crisis behind the throne where you had a division in the Russian army where the officers were divided on it. You had some officers that supported Nicholas, then you had some that supported Constantine, that wanted to basically give him the throne. A lot of them went to where the Winter Palace is. I think they were actually mostly, it became like a standoff between both sides, is eventually what would occur. Nicholas, of course, basically had to do something about this because he had come to power at this point in 1825. And so he basically, when they revolted, he basically crushed it, is what he did. So I think it was about 3,000, it says there, Russian officers were actually involved in it that refused to give their loyalty to Nicholas. They would only give it to Constantine. And so they were called Decembrists because it happened in December of 1825. They supposedly met in what is called the Senate Square today in Russia, in St. Petersburg. which I think used to be called Peter Square, where the statue of Peter, that equestrian statue of Peter is. Of course, I showed you before. So it was a standoff between both sides. And so eventually Nicholas basically used artillery on them, fired on them, basically, and broke it up. And what happened was a lot of the Decembrists, those that weren't killed, those that were arrested were put on trial. And some of them were executed. And then some of them even, as you know, went into exile. And their wives did too. Like their wives, or even, I think some were even where they had women engaged to some of the men, they went into exile with them. I think they were called Decembrist wives, basically. So a lot of times when people would go in exile, like Siberia, usually their children, their wives would, go with them and all that. You see, it says on the bottom left, the Decembrists became the forerunners of revolution in Russia. Yeah, that's true about that because they think it's one of several of these revolutions that kind of break out in Russia, where radicals want to try to overthrow basically the establishment that's in power. Now, the other thing about him that's famous about Nicholas, of course, you'll start seeing also the fact that they begin to try to expand more. So you get people, besides being, exiled there, you get people that start to move to Siberia, help colonize it and all that. So geographically, like I said, Siberia starts to be expanded more. More people began to settle there in the 1800s, especially by the end of the 19th century. They also try to start industrializing Russia under Nicholas. They do try to do that a little bit as well. He is famous for helping to establish a road system that linked Western Russia with Eastern Russia into Siberia. And you can see it even went down into parts of like Mongolia and China. And it was known as the Siberian route, or some people also call it the Great Siberian Route, is what they called it. They also had another nickname. They call it the tea route as well, because they got a lot of tea and other things from China, basically. And so you can see the route that he would take. And that route is going to be kind of similar to the Trans-Siberian Railway highway system that'll kind of run west to east across Russia today. So that's going to help to enact trade and all that. And I think that's part of why the Crimean War broke out later, because the fact that the European powers like France, Britain are kind of concerned that now the Russians are getting into China. You can see there too with trade as well because of that road system and all that. That's the other thing I did want to talk about today. That was the big thing that happened at the end of Nicholas I's reign, of course, was the Crimean War conflict that broke out. 1850s, 1853 to 56 was the years of the Crimean War. It was a major conflict. In fact, one of the most famous conflicts in Europe, I think, besides the Napoleonic Wars and maybe the Franco-Prussian War that happened at the time in the 1800s. Got the American Civil War. We don't really talk about that much, like in Europe. But yeah, the Crimean War, you had different sides. Russia, of course, pitted against the Ottoman Empire, with also the British and the French backing them in the war. You can see it started March of 1854 is about the time period of when France and Britain came in. Initially, it was like Russia versus the Turks, and then they came in. But you can see it lasts till February of 1856. So it's a war that lasts, of course, a long time. I'll get into, of course, the Crimean War and talk about the causes of why it got involved. You can see, of course, images of soldiers that fought, of course, in the Crimean War. Which, by the way, the Crimean War is one of the first wars where the battlefield and soldiers are actually photographed. Because if you know about photography, kind of takes off in the 1800s, which the French, I think, invented photography. If you know about that, but there's different causes of why the war broke out. I'll kind of go through a few things that were there, but I know one thing was over the Black Sea and the Balkans Peninsula area. Those were areas that were kind of an issue because if you know about the Russians had the Black Sea Fleet that was in the Crimea, which it still is today, right there. Of course, the Russians want to control the Crimea. That's kind of an issue. Also, the Russians want to control the Balkans or push into the Balkans. The reason for that is the fact that the Russians were hoping to take back territory that was part of the Byzantine Empire. Because remember, I talked about before how the Russians saw Constantinople as the third Rome, which the Turks control it now, Istanbul. So they hope to take that back from them, and make that part of, lands that are Christian or whatever. And so that's definitely another reason for why, of course. And by the way, Nicholas was the one that thought that the Ottoman Empire was declining in the 1800s. He's the one that called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe, as you may have heard of before. He's a sick man dying in a bed or whatever. And so, yeah, the Ottoman Empire was declining, of course, in the 1800s. And so he was right about that. And he thought, I guess he could knock it over and just take their land and stuff like that. But it wasn't that easy. Because what happened was the British and the French, they wanted to come in too and support the Turks. Why? Mostly because of trade. And that's the main reason, because, the British, French have trade routes all over the world, not just in the Black Sea, but far east, like in China, etc. France and Indochina and all that. And so Russia's kind of a threat. Remember, I told you they started building that Great Siberian route right in the 1800s to link up trade with Asia and all that. And so that's obviously part of the reason for why that occurred. I guess the British were worried that they might take their monopoly on opium. That was big, of course, in China. Then, of course, the conflict over, believe it or not, religion was another conflict that caused the war too. There was an issue over the churches in the Holy Land, Christian churches, and there was a debate about who should control them. Catholic, which the French wanted, or the Russians wanted the Orthodox Church. And so I think the Ottomans were more in favor of the Catholic Church controlling them. And so that was another thing that caused France and Russia to go to war, believe it or not. The Crimean War, you can see, by the way, the Allies later, what they do, they invade the Crimean Peninsula with their naval forces up, you can see, through where the Dardanelles Straits and Istanbul is today. And so you can see that later they're going to land forces on the Crimean Peninsula and try to take it from the Russians. And so that's primarily where most of the fighting took place, was on like the southern part of Russia and the Ukraine. And then you can see all the areas they fought too in the Balkans, kind of south of Russia, close to where Romania is and all that. And so those are other areas that they fought also. And they fought on the Black Sea, like naval engagements, also as well. One thing about the war, which is very famous, the Crimean War is considered one of the first major modernized wars. I think that and the American Civil War, those two, you start seeing a lot of modernized warfare taking off. So it's one of the first wars where they used railroads, the ship supplies, men to war. Telegraph was starting to come into use for telecommunications, which telegraph took off really in the 1830s. They started doing that as well. So they're able to know kind of what's going on at the front lines. People even know the casualties of the war right away. First photograph war, I think I just mentioned about that, which is true. So you get images like that on the right, where they're actually images. That's probably colorized, I guess, some of the images later maybe. But that's something you start to see. So, same thing with American Civil War. You start to see like pictures of the battlefield and soldiers and things like that as well. Also, other things, I'll get to the siege of Sevastopol in a second, but militaries, a lot of your militaries started to use things like mass-produced rifles. Start to see that a lot in the 1800s. Exploding artillery shells, whether used by, land artillery or naval artillery. Sea mines are starting to be used, which I think in the old days they called them torpedoes, about that. Armored ships, started to see that in the 1850s, 1860s. Long-range cannons starting to be used. So it's one of the first wars, this one in the American Civil War, where steel is starting to be used a lot because it's starting to be mass-produced, etc. Oh, I forgot about this, but something I usually talk about that's real famous. about the Crimean War, as y'all probably heard about. But modern nursing supposedly began because of the Crimean War, mostly from British influences, and it made Florence Nightingale famous. If you know about her, she was a famous English nurse that helped start modern nursing and even help establish hospitals to treat like wounded soldiers during the war and all that. And so she's considered to be one of the founding um, women that helped create modern nursing. I think before that, men did nursing and stuff like that, more than women. And then I know in England, she created some of the first nursing schools where they basically taught women to become nurses, etc. So she's kind of famous. She was known as the lady with the lamp. You may have heard of that, of course, before. But yeah, going back to what I was talking about, I'll get to, of course, the results of the Crimean War, which didn't go well, I guess, for the Russians in the end. But the siege of Sevastopol, that basically was one of the most famous aspects of the whole Crimean War. What happened was in 1854, the coalition powers, which involved, by the way, the French, the British, also the Turks, and I think I want to say, I think it was the Kingdom of Sardinia, one of those states, where Italy was involved too. But they invaded the peninsula, and it led to a siege of what is the city of Sevastopol, which that was a famous port city that's there on the Crimea, which the Russians now control. And the siege lasted for almost a year, around a year, October 1854 to September 1855. And it resulted in a majority of the casualties, of course, in the Crimean War. The Crimean War was a pretty bloody conflict. I think the total casualties in the war were something like 600 to 700,000 overall combined on both sides. And neither side really could really win. It was kind of like a debacle, if you know about that. But what happened was the Russians eventually decided to withdraw their forces. Is what happened? I guess, and they scuttled their Black Fleet. The Russian Black Fleet was actually scuttled. By the way, I do mention sometimes about this famous event that I know the British make a big deal about it, which is the Charge of Light Brigade. You may have heard of that, which was from a famous poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It's actually from a battle called the Battle of Balaclava, which I think they consider that to be the most famous battle that was part of the siege of Sevastopol, which happened on October 25th, 1854. But it was actually indecisive. Neither side won the battle. It's kind of weird about that. But it was kind of immortalized by Alfred Lord Tennyson, of course, in the famous Charge of the Light Brigade, which is well known, written later. So yeah, a lot of these battles were indecisive, but like I said, the Russians were forced to scuttle the Black Sea Fleet, of course. And the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1856, I think February, I think it was. And under this particular treaty, the Russians couldn't occupy Crimea for a bunch of years, I think several decades after that. And they couldn't even have naval forces on the Black Sea. So that was something that kind of helped to, I guess, neutralize the Russians for a while in the 19th century. The Russians, by the way, were humiliated about what happened in the Crimean War. And it really helped. I think it forced the Russians to really rethink their empire, even led to some reforms and I think industrialization afterwards. But they do think that it helped to kind of break down the whole conservative order in Europe because Russia kind of withdrew more and became isolated from, I guess, the other European powers. And so they think that led to why a lot of the unification of Germany, Italy kind of occurs later. So you'll see that, of course, with that. But a lot of historians seem to think that the Crimean War was a turning point on the Russian Empire, and that it does kind of start its decline, later in the 1800s. Because they do kind of lose, not just that war, but the Russo-Japanese War and all that And so a lot of their pride is kind of, tainted because of it. Now I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk about more, of course, into some other things, of course, that happened afterwards. So that's going to lead to some reform afterwards, like I'm saying, that occurs, of course, in Russia. And one of the big things that's going to occur is that under Alexander II, they're going to actually create internal improvements, like reforms, modernization, building more railroads and things like that. And of course, abolishment of serfdom. I think that's one of the biggest things that, of course, happened if you know about what occurred under the Russians in the 1860s. And what happened was in 1861, the Russians decided to basically emancipate the serfs. And it was done under Tsar Alexander II, who later was given nicknames like the Tsar Liberator, Alexander the Liberator, I think is another nickname they called him. I think somebody called him like the Russian Lincoln because, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, all that. And so that's something that was done through a emancipation, I think a manifesto that went out in that year. The amount of serfs that were, by the way, freed was something like 25 million people that had been bound to the Russian land or to the nobility or even to the monarchy and all that. And so all these people were freed throughout Russia at that time. What kind of rights they get afterwards? Where serfs were then given citizenship, so they became official citizens of Russia. They had a right to marry without the landowner's consent, which had been kind of an issue before. They could own property. They could even own a business or a farm, things like that, if they could get the money to buy it, which was kind of an issue they had, of course, afterwards. He was known for enacting land reforms, which was true as well. They had what they call, it's called different names, but they call it either Obscena or usually called Mir, I think was the common, nickname they called it, which Mir, I think means in Russian means village, but or commune or society can mean also as well. But basically it was this type of communal village where the peasants would kind of share the land, be able to farm it. So communal farmland was the idea of what it is, and it was kind of considered like an agricultural commune. It would be basically kind of what it would be basically, but it was more similar to like the open field system in medieval Britain, would be kind of what it would be compared to. And it wasn't like capitalist type farming. It wasn't that really, but later on they'll actually try that. I know under Nicholas II they have these so-called Stolypin reforms where they try to make farming more capitalist. They try that, and then about the Bolsheviks, like under Lenin and others, Stalin, especially Stalin later, they'll have collectivization, collectivize everything and no capitalism and things like that. Another thing too about Alexander II, you may have heard about the fact that he's the one that sold Alaska to the United States in 1867. They decided to give that up because the Russian Empire was, I guess, in financial difficulties after the Crimean War and all that. And so for $7.2 million, they sold Alaska to the United States under Andrew Johnson. And at the time, the Secretary of State was William Seward. And so the joke in America was that it was called Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. They called it as well. And people made fun of it because they thought we were just getting a bunch of icebergs and polar bears and things like that. But it proved to be profitable later, because they found gold there, found oil, and all that. And so Alaska, one of the 49th state or whatever later, 1950s, is something that we gained from that period in the 19th century. Now, also on the bottom right, you have Alexander III. He was the son of Alexander II. He came to the throne because his father was assassinated by these Russian radicals that were called the People's Will. That I think he was going through his carriage through St. Petersburg. They threw a bomb at him, and they blew his leg off, Alexander II, and so he was killed. And so, this radical group was like one of several of these radicals that try to, want to overthrow the Romanov regime and all that. And so what ends up happening is this czar becomes a reactionary. That's one thing about Alexander III, who comes in. He reverses even some of the reforms that his father did, Alexander II. And then one thing he's very, very famous for, Alexander III, he was very pro-Orthodox Christian. He wanted to, spread Christianity and make more reforms to that church. But he was also very anti-Semitic. He hated Jews, and they think it's under him that he initiated a lot of pogroms throughout the country, in Russia and the Ukraine, to kick Jews out. And pogroms were these mass riots where they basically attacked Jews and sometimes killed them. And a lot of Jews fled Russia because of this. They would migrate to other parts of Europe or even America. I think you see this in that. You ever seen that? I think there's a movie called, what's the name of it? Fiddler on the Roof. They kind of show that, Fiddler on the Roof. Have you ever seen that movie? It's kind of famous, but they kind of show at the end the Jews forcing them to leave because of all the pogroms against them and all that. And the Okhrana was also big, cracking down on people, sending them to Siberia and things like that. He was also known as the peacemaker. It's kind of weird about Alexander III, but he actually made peace with foreign countries like Britain, France, and all that, which was instrumental later, of course, in World War I. Also, another thing about him you may have heard about too, Alexander III was the one that began the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway network. It started in 1891 at the end of his reign, and it was completed under Emperor Nicholas II's reign during World War I. And of course, it would connect Russia with Siberia in the Far East. It would go from Moscow all the way to really the Pacific Ocean. And it was actually also a railroad that was used to connect, I guess, Western Europe with Eastern Europe and Asia. Like a road that you can go from Britain all the way, I guess, to the Pacific Ocean if you want. And it's actually the longest railway system in the world, like somewhere around almost not quite 6,000 miles. I want to say 5,800 miles, I think, is the length of it. But there's legs that go down, if you know about this, into like Mongolia, China, and even North Korea as well. So they use that to obviously connect trade with those areas. Here's a better map kind of showing you where you can see all the legs that go down, of course, into China, etc. And so that helps to enact trade, of course, through that area. It also helped to, cause a lot of migration too. So because of this particular railway, you get more people that begin to migrate. And by World War I, you get like 10 million people that actually migrate into Eastern Russia because of that. Yeah, I think today around 20% of the population actually lives in Siberia, to give you kind of an idea. So maybe 30 million people maybe live there roughly, but most people in Russia live predominantly in the western part, like west of the Urals and all that. Now, one more czar I'll kind of talk about. Of course, you had the last czar of Russia later, which is Nicholas II. He will reign from 1894 to 1917. There he is, of course, on the left, and of course, with his family that he's very famous for. His wife, of course, is also well known. Her name was Alexandra. Only thing about under him is that Russia starts to decline under his reign. A lot of it was caused by different things. I'll get to it later, but the Russians suffer, of course, the Russo-Japanese War. They lose that conflict where the Russian Navy was badly defeated by the Japanese Navy, believe it or not, in the Far East. I think because they were kind of trying to fight over like Korea, I know, at the time. And, the Japanese end up in Korea taking it over for a while. And then, of course, you have other like the 1905 revolution. They have the 1917, of course, Russian Revolution that happened. And then all the defeats in World War I against Germany, all these different conflicts, of course, later end up leading to, of course, his regime getting overthrown. the so-called February Revolution, they call it later, where he gets overthrown. And that'll be in really March of 1917, but it was actually February in their calendar. But he'll eventually get overthrown, and that ends basically the Romanov dynasty in 1917. Later, when the Bolsheviks take over, Vladimir Lenin, the famous communist, Russian communist, they'll create the Soviet Union, but they'll execute his Lenin. Lenin executes basically Nick II and his whole family. They all get killed, as you know. I think they were killed in 1918, a little later. But that's going to. I'll get to it later. We'll talk more about later how that's going to eventually lead to the rise of the Soviet state. Soviet Union is going to be created, of course, because of what happens in Russia under the last Tsar, Nicholas II. But we'll get more into that when I get to like World War One later, like probably next week. So later in the week, I think tomorrow, I'll kind of continue talking about, of course, the Industrial Revolution, how that affects not just Britain, but other countries. We'll get into that. I'll also talk about the rise of socialism as well, because socialism is something that's kind of like something that really affects a lot of people because of the rise of, communism that we talk about. So before I go, don't forget, these are some of the assignments that are out there. First exam, that's the thing you'll need to kind of work on the most. I know this week you get that done because that's due later this week. British quiz is out, of course, still. Second vocab due by Friday as well. So just kind of want to remember to remind you, of course, about those different assignments that are out there. So that's it for today. I don't think I see any other comments or questions, of course, about this lecture, but y'all take care, and I'll see you later in the week. I'll send some announcements, of course, about, of course, the upcoming lecture for tomorrow as well. So y'all take care, and I'll see you later.